You know what? I'm going to pause it. Okay. So Aaron Weiner is a board-certified psychologist and addiction specialist and speaks nationally on the topics of addiction, behavioral health, and the impact of drug policy on public health. He earned his doctorate from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and completed his fellowship in addiction psychology at the VA Ann Arbor healthcare system. His perspective is informed by years of experience growing and directing addiction services lines for hospitals and healthcare systems, the current state of medical and psychological research, and his own observations in private practice. Dr. Weiner is the president-elect of the Society of Addiction Psychology, a member of the Physician Speakers Bureau for the National Safety Council, and on the Science Advisory Board for Smart Approaches to Marijuana. So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Weiner tonight, and we look forward to his presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Weiner, for joining us.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for the introduction, and thanks everybody for taking the time this evening to come and be part of the webinar and learn a little bit about what's going on right now with mental health in youth and what as caregivers and parents we can do about it. Give me just a second. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So that we can, have a presentation. But so the looking at these trends and then what to look for and what to do about it is going to be our focus for tonight. One of my main lanes is in more substance use related things, and we'll talk about that a bit, but really the main focus for tonight is on mental health, the mental health of teens, and then how we can interface with that as caregivers. If you have questions about anything that we're talking about tonight, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is here in the bottom left of this first slide, aaron@weinerphd.com, and it will be on the last slide as well. So please do feel free to reach out if there's anything that I can do to help, because we may get to the end and have less time before the top of the hour for questions. I'll plan to stay late. Happy to answer them if you have them, but in case you have to go. So all that being said, let's go ahead and dive in and see where the hour takes us. So let's talk about what's going on with mental health generally right now, which is that honestly, it's not so good. And this is something that you might be experiencing yourself. I know certainly it's been a very roller coaster of the last 2 years for me. And I think that goes for just about everybody in the world, if not just our country. And there's a lot of different places we could go for data visualization on this, but one of the most striking for me is just this abrupt change and increase in positive screeners on Mental Health America's website. These guys do screeners for anxiety, and here you're looking at moderate to severe screeners in the months before the pandemic began, and then as it began. And you can see here how quickly everything picked up. And then here's that same thing for depression. And it actually stayed at that rate for the past 2 years of people struggling with anxiety, struggling with depression at rates that we have not seen for a very long time. Now, these screeners go for all age ranges, and it's been a little bit tougher to get nationally published data for teens in particular. But I was able to find some, and we've got some local data that the hosts were generous enough to provide, so I've put in the presentation. But what we know is that kids have not been immune to this. 46% of parents reported a new or worsening problem, with teen girls showing slightly more of these problems than teen boys in general. Health insurance claims also were up 20% for mental health. And addiction and substance use was definitely one of these things, but also anxiety, depression, self-harming, just a lot of things that ideally we don't want our kids to do. And we'll talk more in a minute about why they do it. A lot of it is a response, though, to this increased burden of stress. Now, in terms of local data from where you are, there is a very significant and high prevalence rate, particularly of anxiety. So this is looking at over the past month, what percent of kids in each grade endorsed anxiety, which is the blue line, the dark blue line, depression, which is the lighter blue line, and loneliness, which is the gray one. And so you can see there that anxiety is over 50% in every single grade. And the others are hovering right around there as well, which is, and these are for those who said that they sometimes or frequently felt these things over the past month. this is really a lot higher than you'd like it to be. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily higher than national average, but I think it paints a very clear picture that what's going on right now with mental health for kids is not a good thing. This is more data locally from where you are in terms of what young people were saying causes them a lot of stress. Their top 4 categories, they basically all have to do with school, getting good grades, getting into a good college, taking standardized tests, meeting my parents' expectations. I can tell from looking at this that you guys are probably in a very high achieving school district type area. We tend to see this a lot where there's a lot of AP classes where there are those high parental expectations, but it does add that extra layer of anxiety that you're seeing manifest in the kids. The bottom 4 categories have 3 of those have to do with finances, and the other has to do with being popular, which is actually, I mean, I'm not sure what was in the middle, but I'm glad to see that's on the bottom too. Being yourself as opposed to conforming to fit a mold is a good thing. But certainly school is a major factor. This is one more slide of local data right now, showing the difference in terms of school-related stress, what the kids are feeling versus what the parents think. And so particularly in grades 7, 8, and 9, parents were very much underestimating how much stress the kids put on themselves, how stressed out they actually felt. That gap closed a bit in the sophomore and junior years, but then apparently like seniors, back when I was in high school, they stopped caring quite as much their senior year. Parents still think they care, but the kids stop caring quite as much. But specifically, the take home here is that in younger grades, there's probably more stress going on than you think. And at least up until senior year, it's still very much a significant concern for kids. That the adults are just starting to catch on a little bit more. Now, broadening back out to the national lens, this is actually the mental health of kids, the stress, the depression has gotten so bad that we've seen a couple of somewhat unprecedented steps that have been taken over the last 6 months or so. In October, there was a joint declaration of national emergency in children's mental health put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Children's Hospital Association, and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. This sort of thing basically never happens, where everyone's saying, no, there's a really big problem going on. And part of what prompted them to say this was there was this spike, and that's what you're seeing in this graph here, of the percent of emergency department admissions due to some sort of mental health related condition. So this, generally speaking, has to do with some sort of suicidal ideation or so thinking of killing yourself or self-harm, something along those lines. And it also prompted the Surgeon General back in December of last year to release a 53-page advisory talking about youth mental health specifically. And this is something that he's talking about now also. This is one of his big messaging points, is that right now youth mental health is suffering. And I won't read off this whole slide to you. I encourage you to download this and read it if you're interested, but COVID has very much been something that has put this additional strain on kids. So in terms of knowing then whether or not there's actually a problem going on around mental health, because we're in this very bizarre context where we're all under a tremendous amount of pressure. And so like where quote unquote normal is shifted a bit, and it's sometimes difficult to tell. But even within this paradigm, there is a difference between normal reactions and problematic reactions to stress. And this is something where, and I think I have this on a slide later as well, but one of the most important things that you can do as a parent is to be connected to your kids and their lives and their emotional states and patterns. Even if they're not necessarily the most receptive at the beginning, it's really important to do that, because if you don't know what normal is, you're not going to know when it changes. And so what might seem for one teen to be very different sort of behavior, a change, something to be concerned about, might actually just be the baseline for another one. And so making sure that you understand where that baseline is really important if you're going to detect changes. So I just want to put that out there right here at the beginning, that it's really important to have that connection. And if you don't have it right now, if you're reflecting and thinking like, wow, like I really do feel like I don't know too much about my child's emotional world, now's a good time to start. And we'll talk about how to do that a little bit later on. So things to watch for if your child is having and is in emotional distress. Let's break this down into two categories: internalizing and externalizing. So internalizing symptoms are essentially when you're folding into yourself. You've got the stress or negative feeling of some sort. You don't know what to do with it. And so you kind of just bottle it up. You keep it inside. And so there's a set of symptoms that are related to that. Externalizing is when you've got that pressure, that tension, that negative energy inside, and you let it out. So you externalize it. So things to watch for across these two categories: for internalizing, academic problems, difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating, just shutting down. Like it seems like closing off, withdrawing socially. Somatic problems, so problems with your body. So like if it seems like they're complaining of more headaches or stomach ache, just problems with the way they feel physically. That can sometimes be a sign of bottling in this stress. And then excessive time in social media or games. Again, this is different from normal. So if normally that's where they are, that may also be problematic in and of itself, actually, but that's a whole different topic. But if you notice that it seems like your child, who at one point was very just outside their room, talking a lot, engaging, is now really struggling, staying up late at night, having trouble concentrating during the day, just closing off, that's a sign that something's up. You might not know exactly what, but something's up. Externalizing symptoms can be things like moodiness and defiance, alcohol and drug use, certainly having a lot of sensitivity to criticism, and or constructive feedback could be another way to put that. But the idea behind that, and this goes for just about any age group really, is that if you have this narrative in your mind that you're really insecure about and you feel bad about, and then someone reinforces it, they like tell you the thing that you desperately don't want to think or believe about yourself, that does not feel good. That does not feel good at all. And particularly if you're a young person and you don't have the same sorts of emotional controls, that can lead to lashing out. Reckless or self-destructive behavior can mean a number of different things, but generally it doesn't mean that everything that the child feels safe, that the child feels stable. And then violence or acting out. Again, like these are the sorts of behaviors where if it's happening, it's important not to just normalize it or think that it's okay, or they're just having a hard time. I've talked to a lot of parents who rationalize behavior that's honestly really concerning. And and sometimes it's easy if they're younger, like say 9, 10, 11, to not take violence or acting out behavior as seriously. But the problem is that if that continues, when say like an 11-year-old boy turns into a 16 or 17-year-old boy, you've got a much bigger problem on your hands, and I guess to be frank, on their hands too, because the consequences really ratchet up as well. So specific things to watch out for in terms of there being problems. And for depression, things to look for: negative thinking, expectancies and comments, statements of low self-esteem. So just being very pessimistic, talking and thinking very badly about themselves, not believing in what they can do, not enjoying normally pleasurable activities. So if they used to do things like extracurriculars or hang out with friends, even hanging out with a family, and they just don't seem interested in anything anymore, that's a sign of depression. Frequently crying is kind of self-evident, but something to watch for as well. I want to talk about a couple of suicidal indicators that right now, this also could be an hour-long talk just in and of itself, but just some really important ones to watch for if it gets to this point. Thought statements or writing about death or suicide, as well as speaking positively about the impact of their death. We all contemplate our mortality sometimes, and teens certainly aren't exempt from that. And at the same time, there's a certain point when that starts to be either like an odd sort of fixation, which is worth examining, or if it seems like particularly the idea of killing yourself, suicide, as opposed to just thinking about mortality, that should definitely be a red flag. Check into that. Certainly the ideas of things would be better if I wasn't here for you or for me or anything like that, take that very seriously. And if you see them giving away valued items, that's a huge red flag. One other one to watch for is that if you know that your child is depressed and then all of a sudden it seems like they're feeling better, that actually could be a very dangerous sign as well, because sometimes when people make the decision to kill themselves, that's like taking a weight off their shoulders and they feel happy because they think that they're going to get relief. So certainly if you've got someone who's working on their depression and they're getting better gradually over time, that's fantastic, that's normal, that's great. But if it seems kind of abrupt and there isn't a good explanation, that's another thing to question rather than just straight up celebrate and make sure that everything is actually okay. On the anxiety side of things, look for a general sense of overwhelm, feeling flustered, having a hard time thinking about things, always worrying about something. If you are looking more at social anxiety, you might start to notice avoidance of certain activities or groups. Avoidance is something that we call a safety behavior, which can take a lot of different forms. Safety behaviors do, but it's basically something that you do where you think that you're keeping yourself safe from a potentially dangerous situation or threatening situation. And when you do that, you get this sense of relief because you avoided it, which feels really good. We like feeling relief. But then unfortunately, that means that we're more likely to do it again. And then that can lead to this loop where someone never actually faces their fear. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. And certainly if a young person's having panic attacks, definitely worth getting some help for that. That's if they're having rapid heart rate, feeling really flustered, like they need to get out of certain situations. Basically, your fight or flight response gets triggered and you feel like you just really, really, really need to leave. Another problem that's become much more common over the course of the pandemic are eating disorders. And this is something that, for whatever reason, we don't talk about as much, but is common enough that we really should. It tends to happen more often in young girls than boys, but absolutely boys can have eating disorders as well. It really, the core aspect is that there's this preoccupation with food or weight, generally also going along with body dissatisfaction. And that's part of why we tend to see it more in females than males, because there is all that societal pressure around looking a certain way. But it also serves for many as a way of controlling something about their life. And this is something right now in the context of COVID that is very appealing for people, because there are so many things that for the last 2 years have felt out of control. And so you might not be able to control what's going on in your school or in the world or in your own home or in your own mind. There's a lot of reasons why someone might really want this, but you can control what you put in your body and how much you weigh. And so that's why it's something that's easier to lean on for people who are just trying to find some way to deal with it. Look for skipping meals or excessive exercises. Binging, so that means eating lots and lots of food and then leaving after meals, oftentimes to the bathroom to purge. So then vomiting. Now that might not be something that you see because that's something that they would do alone in the bathroom. But if you're seeing this binge purge cycle, they're going to ask to leave after meals or be spending a lot of time in the bathroom in order to vomit. Certainly weight change is one of the hallmarks of many eating disorders. Most of them, I'd say, either weight gain if they're binging without the purging, or losing a lot of weight in the case of anorexia, which is when you're just restricting your food intake to the point that you lose a bunch of weight, or if you're binging and purging, which is the hallmark of bulimia. Both of those involve weight change. And then specifically, if there's vomiting going on, if you're noticing that your teen is having a lot of cavities than when they didn't before, or enamel erosion when they go to the dentist, that can be a sign that they're vomiting a lot. And so just something to watch for there. So the last topic to talk about before we pivot a little bit is substance use. And this is a big one, and is another way young people are trying to deal with their feelings right now. By their senior year, about 70% have tried alcohol, 50% have used some type of illegal substance, and I am grouping marijuana into that. 40% will have smoked a cigarette, 20% will have misused a prescription. And this all leads to the fact that 90% of the people in the general population who have a diagnosable substance use disorder start when they're a teenager. And there's a lot of biological reasons for that we're not going to dive into today, but bottom line is if you prime your brain to develop an addiction when you're a teenager, you're much more likely to have one that sticks around, either the one you started with, whether or not it's nicotine or cannabis or alcohol or whatever it is, or to develop a new one. Now, in terms of trends of what's going on right now and what kids are using the most, both nationally and we'll drill down to locally is in just a second, is that vaping is huge. If you look at these chunks of red here, and it's all under vaping, nicotine and marijuana. And then there's a little bit here also with smoking marijuana daily as well, but it's mostly clustered around the vaping because right now there's been a huge social trend marketing initiative. We'll talk about flavors in a second, but pushing kids towards vaping. The 2020 data that we have, fortunately, has not shown the significant increase, which is what we've seen year after year for a while. But a lot of folks in the field of addiction psychology, myself included, think that this is a bit of an artifact of the COVID experience, where it was a lot harder for kids to use substances because they were home a lot. There were a lot of changes to routine. They didn't have the socialization opportunities that they did before. I think when 2021 rolls around, we'll see things got a little bit more loose there. But to be perfectly honest with you, I am very concerned at what the 2022 data, so what we're going through right now, that unfortunately we won't get for a couple of years, but I think it's going to be bad. I guess I'll just be blunt about it. I think it's going to look really bad because when you have a national emergency declared in youth mental health, that rolls downhill because kids have to figure out a way to cope with that. And using substances is a primary way they've done that in the past. Now, in terms of locally, what's going on, alcohol is the most reported substance that you guys specifically are seeing. There's a big jump between junior and senior year as well in alcohol and marijuana specifically. It's worth mentioning, if you compare this to the graph on the previous page, your alcohol numbers specifically for seniors are significantly higher, I'd say, than national average. Marijuana is right around the rate. Vaping actually is a little bit less for you, but alcohol in particular is something that seems to be very problematic right now. And so it's something to pay attention to, both within the family as well as I'm sure your prevention coalitions have their eye on this. That's, you know, they were the ones who provided me with this data, so they are aware. But just something as parents to keep in mind is that this is definitely a very local, an issue locally that's even more pronounced than nationally. But pivoting back to vaping for a second and marijuana, which are the other two big ones, both locally and nationally, we've got one of the biggest issues around all of this right now, but particularly around cannabis, particularly around vaping, is that there's a huge addiction for profit industry trying to sell them to kids. I guess just, again, to be blunt about it, because flavors like this with, you know, like pineapple slush and blueberry ice and all of that, we know that this is to get kids. And that's why flavors were banned in cigarettes in 2009. And the only reason why this is allowed to occur is that the vape industry is promoting a loophole that allows them to, they're saying that their products contain tobacco-free nicotine, which means that they can't be regulated in the way that tobacco is regulated. Not sure if that's actually true, but they're saying that it's true, and they're clearly just pushing this for as long as they can before they get shut down. But unfortunately, until that time occurs, which the FDA has not been timely about at all, we still have to deal with it. The other side to know, on the addiction side of the coin, is that the marijuana that people are using today is very different than what we had in the past. The THC content, which is the part of marijuana that gets you high, has been selectively bred and genetically modified over the years. It started in the 3 to 4% range. And if you look at the left side of the graph, you can see it was there until the mid 90s. By 2018, what the DEA was taking off the street was over 15% THC. And a recent study that looked at what was being sold across the country in states where marijuana sales are legal found that just about everything being sold is over 15% THC. Now that's the green part of these pie charts. And specifically states that just have a medical program, the average there is 19.2 and recreational is 21.5. So an average joint of today's marijuana is literally 7 times stronger on average than what was being smoked at Woodstock. So it's like lighting 7 of those up at once and smoking them. And that does not even account for concentrates, which is mostly what kids are vaping. Concentrates can be 80, 90% pure THC. Just look at a dispensary, pull up their website, you'll see it. But that's 30 times stronger than what it used to be. It's a very different product. It has very different implications. And it's also being sold and marketed like this, with the flavors and candies. And this picture here on the right is from a dispensary here where I am in Chicago, where we were told that we were learning from the mistakes of California and Colorado and all of them. But here we are selling pot lollipops just like everybody else. So just something to be aware of. In terms of the substance use side of the coin, is that there are a lot of pressures put on kids right now. And this, particularly in terms of the vaping side of things, is a fast growing segment and fast growing industry. But this begs the question of, why do we choose to cope poorly? And when it comes to how do you address this, how do you handle this from a parental point of view, I think it's important to understand where honestly we all are coming from. It's not just kids. But a big part of it has to do first with the principle of delayed gratification. And you may be familiar with this experiment, you may not, but very famous psychological experiment where you took young kids and you put them in a room with 2 marshmallows, and the experimenter would say, all right, you can either eat these 2 marshmallows now, or if you can sit for 10 minutes with these marshmallows, I will give you 10 more and you will have 12 marshmallows. And, if we're thinking completely logically about this, 12 marshmallows is better than 2. And so it would make sense. All right, well, let's just sit with these marshmallows and hang out and wait, and then we'll have 12. The problem is that at the beginning of the experiment, you actually have eaten 0 marshmallows and you are faced with the prospect of 2. And so the idea of sitting with 0 marshmallows for a long period of time is very difficult to do. It creates tension, it creates stress. And particularly for young people, for teenagers, for kids, that's a really tough thing to do, is to engage the part of our brain that allows us to control behavior, even when we know in this exact moment how much happier that kid would be if he was eating those marshmallows, right? He would be happier. However, in the long run, he'd have fewer. And what this tension illustrates is these 2 parts of the brain. And so this next slide is my best representation I can find of the human brain on the internet, and it's this. This is a dog driving a Tesla. And the reason why I think that this is the best representation of the human brain is that we've got these 2 parts. One is really advanced. It's what separates us from the beasts. It's our prefrontal cortex. It lets us do all sorts of really advanced high-tech stuff, like planning, having an imagination, synthesizing really abstract concepts, switching between tasks, multitasking, if you will. It's really tough to do. Most animals can't do that. We can do that. That's the Tesla part. However, as technologically advanced, as amazing as its capabilities are, it is weaker than the animal part of our brain, the limbic system, where the emotions sit. And what that part of our brain cares about, it doesn't speak English. But that's also why the dog is a great representation. Dogs don't speak English. They just learn the phonemes of sit mean I sit down. They don't speak English. And that part of our brain doesn't either. Kind of like if you've ever tried to just talk yourself down from a panic attack, it doesn't really work. That's because the part of your brain that's causing the panic attack doesn't respond to that intervention. That's the car part. It's like you're using a car intervention for a dog problem. But that dog part of your brain, all it wants is to give you as much pleasure as it can and to avoid as much pain as it can. And that is it. And so when it's put in a position where either there's a lot of pleasure that it can bring you towards or a lot of pain that it feels like it's going to avoid for you, then it kind of like takes the wheel and drives the car where it thinks it should go. And so going back to this slide, what's going on here, right, is that pleasure part of the brain, that limbic system, that emotional part's like, you have 0 marshmallows. You could have 2 marshmallows right now. They're right there in front of you. And that's super tempting, even though the car part might be like, hey, let's think rationally about this. Dogs don't think rationally. Neither does our limbic system. And the problem is that it develops actually the prefrontal cortex, the car part, later than just about everything else in the brain. It's that blue part in the front of each brain in that diagram. That's the part that develops the most slowly. And so as we get older, we tend to have better behavioral control, which isn't to say that as we get older, everyone's great at controlling their emotions and their impulses. That takes skill. That's why therapists like myself exist. But it's really hard when we're a kid because our brain isn't even fully done developing and growing. And so it's a lot easier for the dog to take the wheel. And so if you think back to having all this pain, right, this depression, this anxiety, the dog doesn't like that pain. It doesn't want us to feel that way. And so it thinks, you know what makes me feel better? Pot makes me feel better. Or you know what makes me feel better? When the number on the scale goes down. Or whatever else they're doing that feels really good in the moment, like diving into social media or playing video games for hours on end. I don't have to think about anything, and maybe even I get like no brainer, right? The dog's like, bring me over there, because that part of the brain is strong. That part of the brain can take control. It's really hard to rationalize. And so that's how kids fall into these traps. And ultimately, when we're talking about parental strategies as well as therapist strategies, that's what we've got to look at, because the behavior, as much as you might look at a child who, say, is spending hours on social media, like on Instagram every night, feeling bad about themselves and then not getting sleep, or who is going out and drinking and then coming home and getting punished, but it seems like they don't care about any of those punishments, and you're just thinking like, why do they keep doing this? Like, this makes 0 sense. The thing to remember is that behavior is purpose driven, always, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. So if you have a young person who is doing something and then getting punished for it, but still doing it anyway, or having a consequence from it, like chronic sleep deprivation or whatever it is, but they keep doing it anyway, that doesn't mean that they're just like crazy, or what's happening is that the benefit they're getting out of it matters more to them than whatever the consequence is. We're very utilitarian that way. There's something very powerful that they're getting from it if the consequence is pretty powerful too, and they don't seem to care about it. And one of the traps, and we'll talk about this in a minute, that parents fall into sometimes is the solution is like, well, all right, let's just ratchet up the consequences then, right? Like if it seems like you don't care about that more than the benefit that you're getting, well, let's just make it so uncomfortable for you that you don't do it anymore. That really doesn't work, honestly, not long-term, certainly. Like, they'll go to college, they'll do whatever they want. Or even in the short term, you might find that you just keep ratcheting up the consequence and it doesn't really make a difference. And so you have to take a bit of a different approach. And that's really what I'd like to spend the last few minutes on, about 15, and then we'll get to questions of how can you help? What can you actually do to make things better? So the first thing, the foundation that we need to talk about is, how do you communicate with your child? And the acronym that I like to use for this, that I did not make up myself, but is really good, is communicate with love. And this stands for listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. So let's go through these. The L is for listening, and that means open listening, or rather, I'm sorry, active listening. And what that means is that you need to show someone that you're listening. You can't just take for granted that people are going to understand that you're paying attention. And there's a lot of ways that you can do this, but 2 that I want to highlight right now are open-ended reflections first. So questions, rather, open-ended questions first. An open-ended question is a question that someone can't just answer with a quick yes or no. They have to and are given the opportunity to expand on it. So these questions tend to start with stems like what, or how, or sometimes why you got to be a little bit careful with, because that can also make someone defensive, like why did you do that? Can come across like you're accusing someone. But if you ask someone an open-ended question, that means that you care enough to hear a response. And then ideally you then reflect that response back to them. And reflecting means you take in the information and then you return it back to the person, but in different words, or you can even reflect back, say, an emotion rather than the content. So like, say you've got, say your child just got a bad grade on a geometry test, and they're in the car and they're talking to you about how they're, how they got a bad grade and they studied really hard and they just feel really bad about it. You can say, wow, like that's so frustrating. And maybe they didn't use the word frustrating, but they sound frustrated. That shows them that you're listening and encourages them to go forward. For those who on the call who might be therapists, you know exactly what I'm talking. This is like hashtag therapy tricks. Us therapists do this all the time. This is how we get people to go deeper. And it's also something, all of this is from a theory called motivational interviewing. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, you'll find that in that literature. The O, though, stands for offering. So specifically, how do you offer guidance and advice? So a lot of times parents will tell their children what they should do. Like, here's how you handle this properly. And the problem with that is that that can come across as very pushy. And if you push, someone can push back. If you don't push, people can't push back. And so an alternative way of offering guidance and advice is to use what we call a feedback sandwich. The guidance itself is the meat of the sandwich. It's the middle. But what comes before it, the first slice of bread, if you will, is asking permission. So before you give feedback or advice, say, hey, I went through something like this when I was a kid. Do you mind if I share what worked for me? Or, I've got some thoughts about this. Would you like some advice? By asking permission first, the person who's receiving the advice is literally asking for it. They're saying, yes, I'm giving consent, I'm asking for it. It means they take more ownership for whether or not they choose to take the advice, because it wasn't put on them. They literally asked for it. So then you provide the information, and then the last slice of bread is ask for reactions. You say when you're done, how do you feel about that? Or you could even explicitly say, it's okay to disagree. Like, I'd love to hear how you feel. This again creates a sense of autonomy around it and shows that you're not pushing. Shows that it's not you versus them, or you're going to tell them what to do, particularly for teenagers who want to be treated like adults. They feel like they're growing up. They like that independence. They want that autonomy. Framing it in this way avoids a whole side of conflict that you don't need. It makes it a lot more likely that they're going to actually take the advice in the first place. The V is for validating. And so that literally that just means let someone know what they're feeling is okay and right to feel. Like I guess just to give you an example, because I think this has happened to everybody. Have you ever been in an argument with someone and they've been like, you're being too sensitive, like just get over it, like your feeling is wrong. And it's like, has that ever worked? Like, never has anyone ever said, you are totally right, I should not be reacting this way. Let's just dismiss my feelings entirely in my whole worldview. I'm just a sensitive person. Never, right? That never happens. And the same thing goes for kids. And even if we know as adults that what they're reacting to isn't the end of the world, saying that comes across as very dismissive. Like I've got a 5-year-old son, and a few months ago, we've got this kitchen island where we eat breakfast a lot. And so my daughter, who's 7, I came down and sat in a chair that was his chair. And it was bad. Like, we're talking like this was like Armageddon, sort of like it was just, and he was so upset about it because, he's at that point was like 4.5 and change is hard. And if we just been like, hey, suck it up, get over it, it's a chair, like that's not going to help him. That's going to make him feel awful about himself. And the same thing goes if we're talking about a first breakup when someone's 15. Or if they've done really well all the way through junior high and now they're in high school and they're struggling, or whatever it is, let someone know that their feelings matter and that they're okay to have. It reinforces the sense of, I can trust my gut, I can trust myself. And after you validate and empathize, actually, which is the next one, you can move forward. And empathizing, it shares a lot of the Venn diagram with validating. There's definitely overlap there, but empathizing is about showing someone that you understand how they feel, or to borrow a phrase from Brene Brown, be in the hole with them. So if someone is struggling, a lot of times they don't actually want like a white knight to come in and like pick him up and throw him on the horse and carry him out. That's kind of disempowering. And a lot of times what people really want first is to be seen and to be heard. And so if you take the time to actually see and hear your child and be there with them first, and then maybe offer that feedback sandwich, that can go really well. If you're empathizing, you're validating, you're listening, then you offer some constructive advice, ask them how they feel about it. That can go to a really good place. And ultimately what all of this does is that it establishes emotional safety, which is the bedrock of any positive relationship. And it's very useful sometimes to step back and just take stock of, do you think your kids feel emotionally safe talking to you? And that doesn't mean that you never provide boundaries or consequences, or that you don't do that parental job, which is really important. But it means, are you a safe person to talk to? Do they feel like you'll be there for them, you'll listen, even if that's something that they're disappointed in or that you're going to be disappointed in? Because if they don't think you are an emotionally safe person, they're not going to talk with you. And you're not going to hear about things that you really ought to hear. And so this is this type of communication that helps build that. But if you don't have this relationship with your child, don't get discouraged if it doesn't happen all at once. Building trust takes time, and they may trust you for a lot of different things. But if emotional support is not one of those things, just recognize this might take a minute, right? This might be something where you need to show them over and over that you're someone who they can trust, and eventually they'll open up with you. So communication notwithstanding, let's talk about where we go from there. That's the base. What comes next? From the proactive standpoint, healthy connectivity is one of the best habits that you can build for your teenager. And this comes, you could look at this in a few different ways. So there's social connectivity. So actually spending time with people face to face is important. That's been really tough in some ways for the past couple of years. It's finally starting to change a bit. Hopefully it lasts. But actually seeing people not just behind a screen is really important. And be a part of the household, not apart from the household. So if your family can be a great source of strength, but don't just do things that you want to do, like do things that you want your kids to do as well. Looks like I got my bullets and images a little mixed up for this slide, but I had that picture there, which also is very old. I don't think anyone's played the Wii for like 10 years, but like actually do things that your kids like to do. So like if that's video games, maybe like play video games with them, learn what they do, show an interest in their life. Really think about what can you do that's engaging that your kids may actually like, and try to capitalize on that. On the behavioral side of things, making sure that kids understand how their behaviors impact how they feel. Because this is the way our brains work. They look at the way our bodies are behaving and then decide what direction they should go. So like the number one rule of getting over depression is don't act depressed, which I know sounds kind of like obvious and simple, but if you act depressed, you feel more depressed. Like if you are laying in bed all day, staring at the wall, on social media and your phone, you haven't seen your friends, whatever the whole constellation of symptoms looks like, that sends a signal to your brain of, oh, this is what I do when I'm depressed. I'm going to feel depressed. There's a lot of really good research that shows how we behave reinforces whatever mood we're in or pushes back against it. So if you've got someone who's depressed, you want them to get out of their room. You want them to be engaging with other people because the alternative just makes them sink deeper. On the anxiety side, avoidance and safety behaviors are central to this. So because we've only got a few minutes left, I'm not going to go super deep into this, but essentially, as I mentioned before, safety behaviors are things that you do that make you think you're avoiding a consequence, but they don't let you learn that it's actually fine to begin with. So like, say, for example, you've got a kid, let's say a very young kid. Say you've got like a child who's like 6 years old and afraid of the dark because they think there's a monster in their closet, but they've got the security blanket. And the security blanket has a monster repelling force field. And they know that it works because every night they go to bed with this blanket, every morning they wake up alive. Ergo, 100% effective monster repelling security blanket, right? Now, as adults, we understand like there's no monster in that closet, but they don't know that because they're attributing their safety to the blanket or the behavior of holding the blanket. That's why they think they're safe. So if you take that blanket away, you take away the safety item, away the safety behavior, they first are going to be extremely anxious. They might not sleep all night, but they'll wake up in the morning and they won't have lost any fingers or toes. And every night they do that, they will similarly wake up alive. And eventually they'll realize the room was safe the whole time. The dark was safe the whole time. The blanket actually was doing nothing. But because they didn't expose themselves to that reality, they couldn't learn. And we see this repeat itself, whether or not it's spiders or school avoidance and school anxiety, school refusal, or I could go on and on. These sorts of behaviors reinforce it because whenever you do it, the safety behavior, and it works, you get the sense of relief. And you feel like, oh, look, the bad thing didn't happen. It must work. Right? There's kind of like a logical fallacy there. So if you see these things happening with your child, stopping that cycle is very helpful. On the emotional side, making sure that they can identify and express emotions is really important, because if they can't, that's eventually how it leads to these unhealthy roots of expression, like eating disorders, like self-harming behaviors, like cutting, or like substance use, alcohol, vaping, and so on. Other things to watch for just at home to not do. So this is, the last slide was a do these things. This is a don't do these things slide. You may have heard this word before, but enabling is a huge problem right now with many families. And this is the standard archetype of this, is like the 25-year-old living in his parents' basement, playing video games and smoking weed all day. Like this is like a class of person. Literally, they could not exist if the parents did not let them live in the basement and play video games all day. Could not happen. And we see this that's what enabling is. Enabling means the behavior would collapse in on itself if it was not being supported by somebody else. And that someone else is oftentimes parents, because as parents, sometimes we think, I need to stop my child from experiencing consequences. I need to stop my child from experiencing failure. I need to not let them feel disappointment. That does them a tremendous disservice, because then they don't learn the consequences of their actions. And so we spent a long time talking about enabling. I'm going to move on for now, but definitely something to watch for if you see this going on in your house. Codependency is a very similar sort of term, where you've got the enabling behavior, where you're someone, so basically the child needs you to act in a way that's detrimental to their health or their mental health. And then you as the parent spend all your time worrying about them and chasing them around and trying to clean up their messes. And that almost becomes like an identity. Like your identity is worrying about your child, and then their identity is using you to keep doing what they're doing, which causes you, and it creates this cycle. So if you see yourself caught in that, there are ways out, but first you need to be aware of it. Parental splitting, where mom and dad or partners in the house are split against each other. Normalizing chaos and lack of consequences, kind of like I mentioned before, where things are going on that really are not good, but because maybe you haven't compared it to other families or haven't had an outside observer or no one's talked to you about it, you don't understand that actually like this is really a bigger deal than it seems. Having one child having negative impact on other children and looking the other way about that, particularly if it's the older child who is struggling, the younger children sometimes are still going to look up to them, and that behavior rolls downhill. It can lead to modeling and then also neglect. If there's a child who's struggling and really soaking up all the parental attention, as well as just chronic stress from the younger sibling or the older, whoever's not having the problem. So things to do to help encourage healthy coping. The first is watch out for their bodies. Everything is harder if our bodies aren't right. It goes for kids, it goes for adults. Help them set boundaries and good habits around sleep, exercise, nutrition. These are all things, by the way, where, how do you help them set boundaries around sleep? We could talk for quite a while about that. Same thing with these other categories. But for now, for today, I just want to put them as items to think about. If you're looking at your child and thinking, you know what, there might be something up here. Screen time limits as well. Meditation is one of the most useful we call it transdiagnostic skills. It helps with anger, it helps with self-regulation, it helps with depression and anxiety, cravings for substances. I mean, it's so incredibly useful, mindfulness meditation in particular. So there's a lot of ways to learn this. There's some great smartphone and tablet apps also that you can get that can help teach this, some that are made specifically for kids if you have a younger child, but meditation is incredibly useful. Just spending the time to talk through them about their emotions and problems is very useful as well. It also models like, hey, this is how we process through our feelings. Talking it out actually it really does help a lot, and giving them that outlet, the ability to even replay something and figure out how they feel about it can be a tremendous help. And then lastly, therapy. And I guess just the quick thing to say about this, and I know I'm biased because I am a therapist, but is that it's not like a badge of shame if you need to take your child to get some help. There's a lot of reasons why kids really could use some assistance. It doesn't mean you're a bad parent. And I guess just case in point, if you've learned anything tonight, like if you've heard anything that you didn't know, that's because I went to school for 6 years for a doctorate. You know what I mean? Like we learned some things doing that, and we can pass that along, and we really can help. And so please don't be afraid to reach out to someone for help. If you feel like your child is struggling, you've maybe tried some things and it hasn't worked, that is really what we're here for. And we tend to be pretty easy people to get along with. So, give it a shot. So some additional strategies to think about. Reward positive behavior. So this is what's paired with those consequences that I was mentioning before. What we know is that positive reinforcement is a more powerful factor for behavioral change than punishment. Punishment matters, but this positive reinforcement is far more powerful. And if you think back to this question about what's going on with a behavior that you don't want to see from young people, remember, they're getting something positive from that. And so if you're just trying to punish it away, it generally doesn't work. If there's behavior you want to see them repeat, like doing their homework before screen time, obeying a curfew, negative drug tests, if you're drug testing a child, for example, which happens sometimes, making sure to actually reward the behaviors you want to see is really, really, really important. Making sure it's meaningful, consistent, paired with the behavior you want to see happen. Acting out, you have to have consistent boundaries and limits. This is so important. I cannot tell you how many parents I've talked to where their child basically runs the house because the parents are like, if I provoke this, it's just going to get bad. They're going to get angry. It's just going to get worse. And so as a result, the child just learns, well, all I need to do is get angry and I get whatever I want. That's bad for the home. That's bad for the child. That's like a lose-lose all around. And so having consistent boundaries and limits and setting them in ways that don't cause damage to the relationship, but let the child know that, no, actually, like, this is where the boundary is. Like, I'm not in charge. Really important. Have access to social media and devices. This is so important. You bought them that phone. You bought them everything that allows them to use it. You need to monitor it. There's so much that goes on those platforms. It is not safe for a teenager, just bottom line. Up until 18, you've got to protect them. That includes from social media, between cyberbullying, sexual predators, drug deals that go on Instagram, Snapchat. I mean, it's all over the place. You've got to be watching. That's could be a whole nother hour right there. Be on the same page as your caregiving partner. If you're not, it creates tremendous amounts of problems and stress. I might not have to even say that if you're living this reality, if you and your partner aren't on the same page. And so actually, like, going through the process of fixing that, whether or not that means also working with, say, a couples therapist if need be, but making sure that, like, trying to find something consistent is really important, or your teenager gets mixed messages and it can really cause a lot of problems. Make sure to take care of yourself and your marriage. If you're married or partnered, as household leaders, you set the tone. And so if you or your marriage is suffering, the kids notice that. They soak everything up. They're also looking at you for, like, what it means to be an adult, what it means to be in a marriage or in a romantic partnership. And so if what they're seeing is like discord and anger and fighting and unhealthy parents and unhealthy coping, what do you think they're going to pick up? right? It's not helpful. I think a lot of times it's very easy for parents to take on like the martyr role, where it's like, I'm just going to sacrifice myself and I'm going to make everything good for my kids. I'm not going to take care of myself. That actually does them a disservice. You need to make sure you take care of yourself in the house, because that trickles down to the kids. So to sum everything up, and then be happy to take some questions. Our kids really need our support now more than ever. It is a really difficult time to be a human being on this earth, but definitely to be a child, particularly where your brain isn't fully done developing yet. The dog is really strong. The car is not done being built. And so they don't really understand how to handle all these emotions. If you stay tuned into them, you'll know what normal looks like. You'll know when it changes, and keep those warning signs in mind. Seek help if necessary. Again, don't be afraid of reaching out for it. There's so many resources. There is, though, a lot that you can do at home. You can build resilience. You can start down the path of these coping skills, and that can be enough if it hasn't gotten really bad yet. And it's absolutely worth doing, forming that relationship, helping your children while you can and when you can. So thank you so much for your time and attention tonight. I really appreciate it. Again, please feel free to reach out to me if there's anything that I can do to help, or if you have any questions. Also, feel free to follow me on social media. I push a lot of news out there all the time, from things going on in the world to new medical journal articles. I also do a live stream show. I've got one coming up tomorrow morning, actually. I'm talking to the author of a new book on addiction, but feel free to check me out on YouTube and otherwise. And I think hopefully you'll find something worth looking at there. So all that being said, I will turn it back over for questions. And thanks again, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiner. That was terrific. A lot of great information in there. So we did have one question so far, but please, everyone, feel free to use the chat or Q&A again to ask your question. If you want to ask anonymously, it's better to use the Q&A button. So someone asked, what would you recommend to do if your child rejects the feedback sandwich?
Well, so that kind of depends on the context, right? Like if it's really dangerous or something like that, sometimes you got to go ahead anyway. But for the most part, you want to say, okay, and respect that and try again another time. If they'll never listen to you, then okay, then maybe you have to take a different tact. But even just the act of you asking, they say no, and you saying, okay, I understand. Well, if you'd like some help, like, I'm here, just let me know. That shows them that you respect their autonomy. And if that has value, then that's the thing to do in that moment. There are some times where they really need to hear something and they don't really get a choice. There are sometimes also when it's important where you could say, okay, I can understand if now's not a good time. When would be a better time? I need to talk to you sometime tonight. Or, like, we really need to talk about it this week. Like you can put a time limit on it to still give them some amount of autonomy and choice while still making it clear, like, you need to talk with them, or there's something that you need to tell them, they need to hear it. But if you have the ability to give them that sense of control and autonomy, oftentimes that's a good way to go.
Okay, and someone did ask about a replay. This is being recorded, so it will be available on our website. And I will let the participants know when that is available. Someone else made a comment. Thank you for your excellent visuals and practical suggestions. They really feel attainable and not overwhelming, which is good. Okay. And then someone did ask, did I hear correctly that safety blankets are not a good thing?
Eventually, yes. I mean, I think it really depends on where you're at. I mean, it might mean that there's a transition at a certain point. I will be the first to say I am not an early childhood psychology expert. I tend to not work with folks under the teenage years very often. So there may be, it might be something that children might grow out of. However, the concept of staying afraid of something if you don't see that it's safe absolutely holds valid. And for young kids, I can absolutely tell you that exposure therapy is oftentimes used to get kids over the fear of the dark or needles or of a lot of different things. So yeah, if it's not causing any harm and they're very young, then I can see that being useful. But at a certain point, it's probably worth them feeling safe in their room. Like if they're using the blanket to feel okay and not just because they like it. That's another distinction to make. It might just be something comforting. and what they like it there versus like, I need this. If they're feeling like it's the dark is dangerous, that's very different than being like, I've had this since I was a baby and I like it. It makes me feel good when it's here.
Okay, and I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, but maybe you want to comment on this. My children protect their friends even when they know their actions are wrong. For example, my son saw his friend buy pot but would not give them up. Is there a way to deal with that in a way that's not confrontational, I guess?
Yeah. Well, so that is an interesting question. I actually have not heard that one before. So here's where my mind goes. I'm trying to figure out how to respond. I think, okay, what's the purpose behind that behavior? That's what I want to know first. Why are they defending their friend? What does that serve? Is it that they feel like their relationship with those friends is more important than the one with you? Is it because they're doing it too, and they feel like they want to, they need to feel like that behavior is okay? Is, there's a reason for, I don't know what it is. I'm not quite sure what to say, but I think that instead of just really like drilling in on like the why aren't you do it like in a negative sort of way, thinking, how do I understand this behavior? Why is this going on? And if it needs to be a teachable moment, if there needs to be a consequence, trying to tease that apart could be useful. But I will say, though, that if a child is very much enmeshed in a friend group that uses substances to get high for fun, and that's like central to like their identity is to be with these friends, it is really tough to extricate them from that. A lot of times that's like where they get a lot of their self-esteem, how they feel good about themselves, sometimes how they feel powerful, those sorts of things. And so that's a really tricky situation, I guess, just to be honest with you, that oftentimes takes, I guess, just to be frank, removing the child from that friend group in a way sometimes is very difficult, so that they can reorient what they care about, because otherwise they're going to be like, well, I just want to be with my friends, I just want to keep engaging in this behavior, my parents are getting in the way, this is cool, this is the way I want to live. Their value system is turned around, and changing that back, giving them a reason to value their relationship with their parents more than their friends, that's very difficult to do at times while they're going back to those friends at school every single day. So it's tricky. The whole, the friend group aspect is really tricky and is a lot easier to be proactive about than reactive about, for sure.
Okay. Can you elaborate on how to be a safe audience for your kids to talk to if they're not doing so currently?
Yeah. So I think the best way that you can do that is so I'm sorry, actually, could you repeat the whole question again? I heard
Yes.
the safe audience if they're not what?
So if they're not currently talking to you, because maybe you're
Oh,
not providing a safe audience, how do you become a safe audience for your kids to talk to?
got it. All right. So the first thing that I would do is acknowledge what's happened in the past, is and say something like, I know I've been very angry before in the past, or I know that I've dismissed your opinion, or we get in fights a lot, and I really want to try to start changing that. As sometimes young people feel very powerless, and so the pushing is like a way to try to like have some sort of autonomy or to be heard or seen. That's pretty normal, actually, no matter your age. People tend to escalate when they don't feel heard. They repeat themselves louder and louder, or they act out in other ways. And so making it clear, like, hey, like, I acknowledge there was a problem. You could even give your child a chance to talk about what they've struggled with in terms of talking with you about it, and just kind of like air that out and talk about your responsibilities as a parent, and what, just really try to just have a conversation that's out in the open about it, and then put those love principles to work. You can separate out emotional safety in a conversation from consequences, right? Those are actually two different things. And if they care more about the consequences than anything, I mean, that's, again, there's a lot we could talk about around this issue. Every case also is different, but ultimately you have to show rather than tell for emotions. That's the dog driving the car. The dog doesn't listen. The dog just feels. And so you need to show, if you're trying to establish a feeling in someone else, if you're trying to establish emotional safety, you need to project that through your actions, through how you communicate. When they share something difficult, when they share their feelings, when they share something that they know is going to disappoint you or has made you angry in the past, reacting to that in an emotionally safe way is how you start to shape that so that they expect something different. So I know that was kind of abstract, but hopefully that helps answer the question.
Okay. Two more questions so far. My late teen daughter has a hard time falling asleep. How do I help her improve that or help that situation?
So I think that depends a lot on why. And so finding out why she has a hard time falling asleep is really important. If it's, say, for example, like, so there's just basic sleep hygiene stuff, like when to stop doing exciting things, when you should put away screens, or at least have them in some sort of night mode. Is it too noisy? Is it too hot or cold in the room? You know, like those sorts of things. If the problem though is more like, say, anxiety, and she's just up late worrying, or if it's anxiety in the form of procrastination, where she's not doing her work earlier in the night because she's like has a hard time doing it and then is up really late trying to get it done, then it's a different story. And there's some tactics that you can take for that. Generally speaking, though, if someone is falling asleep is essentially a process of, it's not an active process. It's more of like a surrender. It's something that your body does naturally when you make the conditions right. And so if, for example, your body is physically relaxed, you are in bed, you start taking some like deep diaphragmatic breaths and you close your eyes and you focus on the feeling of relaxation, you should probably fall asleep within 5 to 10 minutes. And if you're not, there's a reason for it. And whatever that reason is, there's usually solutions for it. But yeah, I hope that helps.
Okay, so next one. So well done, Aaron. Thank you. Any recommendations on books, literature, podcasts that are accessible for parents, teachers, students to help find some common ground on this serious topic?
Really good question. So that is a really good question. Off the top of my head, like big general books, I don't have one to recommend. I have some on specific topics, like for example, that The Big Disconnect is a really good book in terms of screen time in kids. But yeah, if there's specific topics that you're looking for, go ahead and send me an email and I can poke around a little bit. In terms of podcasts, I haven't listened to any parenting podcasts recently, except for I love meditation. I actually meditate. I've meditated every day for like 5 or 6 years. One of the services that I subscribe to, 10% Happier, has, I think, a subscriber only podcast about mindful parenting, which I really like. But I think that's part of that suite. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to get it if you weren't. But yeah, I should research that and have an answer to that question. And I'm sorry that I don't right now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for providing your email too, so that people can email you after this.
Yeah.
We have one more question. My child tends to listen to their friends over what I am saying or my spouse might say. She's 13 years old. Is this just an age thing? Any suggestions on how to discuss versus react? It can be exhausting.
Yeah. So how you handle a situation like this, again, I think has a lot to do with the severity and like what she's listening to her friends about versus you, about how aggressive you want to take it. There's not a problem with a child following bad advice and having a negative consequence. That's learning. What you can try to do, though, is try to help discuss like, hey, so you made this decision and this was the outcome. And this would have been another possible path. How do you feel about that? Trying to help them connect the dots. That's something that you can do if you're trying to give them more room and more latitude, if that's safe or responsible to do so. Ultimately, though, again, going back to a previous point, if it seems like they listen to their friends over you, or they discount your opinion, if they don't, I guess I don't mean to be offensive about it, but if they really don't take you and your opinion seriously, there's a reason for that. If they are either pushing you away or don't see you as credible, or they're choosing 13-year-olds over adults for their information source, there's a reason behind that. I don't obviously know what that is right now, but again, understanding why they're doing that, particularly if you're connecting the dots about it, is a really important question to answer, and to look at it again, to avoid the anger part, which generally isn't helpful. Look at it more like a puzzle. Like, if you approach this in the right way, there's a way to break through. If you approach this, if you solve this puzzle, you're going to be able to help in this situation. If what you're doing isn't working, clearly you need to do something differently, but I don't know exactly what that is, being on the outside of the situation, but that's the mindset that I take to try to suss that out.
Great. Thank you so much. So doesn't seem we have any more questions at the moment. I am going to launch the poll quickly before we lose too many people. So I'm just going to ask people to, to answer these questions. There's only 4 questions. They're multiple choice. So just let us know what you think about with whether we would like to have a follow-up webinar, and what would be the best day time for that to happen, because we do want to be responsive. So anybody, if you could please, great, I see some people are starting to respond. So this is terrific. Thank you very much for participating. Just helps us in future programming as well. So Dr. Weiner, I want to thank you very, very much. Oh, it looks like we do have one more question. Oh, just a comment. Great session. Thank you. So
You're welcome.
it really was. I think the information is so valuable. And again, we will have it on our website. And do I have your permission to share the slides as well?
Oh my gosh, yeah, please share this.
Great. Okay. Wonderful and informative session. Thank you. Another comment came in. Yeah, so I think that's it. We just still have people responding. Okay. So I'm just going to let, everybody responded. That's great. Thank you. Very helpful was another comment. So I'm going to stop the recording now. All right.